So I've decided to do a little commentary on how to build a shower pan specifically, and I'm going to talk through all the various steps so that you guys will understand, because I get a lot of questions about certain steps on how to build a shower pan, and it usually has to do with the pan liner itself and how to do the folds, and I will get to that when we get there. But I'm starting from the very beginning, because of, well, sort of the beginning. So I have my blocking in, you can see. I'm going to speak to that when I get to that point. I also have my drain in, so this is not a tutorial on how to set a drain, but the process that I'm going through here on this shower is the same process I go through on every shower, regardless if it's a slab or if it's an upstairs application like this. So I am now getting my curb ready. It's usually three 2x4s stacked on top of each other, and I'm using screws in this particular case, but usually I'm using 3.5-inch nails with my pneumatic nailer, and you can see I toe nail those screws into the side. So you need a solid support on both your left and right side, which you see I have 2x4s that encompass that area where the curb is at, so that you can actually toe nail those curb pieces in place. And it's redundant. I do it at all three pieces. I don't want that curb to wiggle, to move, to shift, to do anything. And here's my nailer. And so again, I'm using probably about 8 to 10 nails spaced about kind of arbitrary, but about 8 inches apart. There's my second piece of curb material that I'm using. I'll do the same thing. I'll toe nail those into the left and the right side into that solid material that I have on the left and right side, and then shoot a couple of nails about every 8 inches or so. And then my last and third piece will go on top. What I showed in the very beginning is that the grain of your wood should be facing down. It's a little trick my grandfather taught me years ago. But your grain of the wood on the end has a curvature that should be facing down. And that's the very start of the video, what I was showing on the end of that 2x4. And that's the build-up of the curb. That's all it is. You could use brick, you can float your curb, you can do a lot of different ways, but that's how I do mine. Never have a failure. I don't use pressure-treated wood because it tends to warp over time. There's my scabbing, 2x6s between all the studs. And I'm showing that there is definitively scabbing going on here too, with some I think 5/8 plywood, and it's very solid. I toe nailed it in with finish nails with my nailer, because I couldn't get around those pipes that were too close to that bottom plate, and so I do use plywood when necessary. And then here is my drain, and I'm going to this is the process that I am getting ready to show on putting the liner down, because once I have my scabbing in and once I have my curb in, that's at the point you want to put your liner in. So I'm just taking out the bolts. It has a locking flange that I've already gotten rid of. There it is. And that's where all your holes and your weep holes and your troughs that go on the inside threads, that allows water to weep down. Although it's kind of redundant now, we don't really need that configuration because we're waterproofing the pan surface, so water will never see those holes anyway. When I get a liner, I always measure out to the highest number, and in this case I think this is a 5x8 pan liner that's already pre-cut, so there's going to be a lot of excess, but no harm no foul. It's better to have more than not enough. As a general rule, your pan liner should go 3 inches above your finished curb. And this obviously goes a good part of 1.5 feet, which is fine. The excess pan liner on the outside will eventually get cut off, and you'll see that process here in a few minutes. So what I'm doing in the corners is a hospital fold. And if you notice the corners, and I think I'm going to show it here pretty soon, if you notice the corners of this particular shower where the 2x4s come together, in both the left and right side, there is a gap, and a lot of people will push their pan liner, the excess pan liner, into that gap rather than do the folds, or they'll create a gap, which is almost always never able to do on showers because there's usually 4 2x4s in the corner that preclude you from doing that. But as a rule, I'm also I'm always doing the hospital folds, if you will. I call them hospital folds, and I always have them going in the same direction. So if I'm folding the pan liner on the inside with the folds on the inside, and you'll see that in a few minutes, then I replicate that on both the left and right. This just as a habit that I have gotten into. I don't have an issue per se if you wanted to push the excess pan liner into that gap that either you created or already exists. I just don't particularly do it because sometimes my pan liner is not this tall, and I feel like if it's a little less of a pan liner and you push that fold into the corner, it'll drop down, and when I pour my mortar has access to that drop down area also, which is why I'm not really keen about pushing the liner inside of there. And what you see here, I'm just using fasteners, in this case, just screws at the very, very top of where the studs are at. It's a minimal amount of screws because ultimately all you're doing is holding the pan liner up in place as much as you can. And so I'm not going down to the top of my 2x6s if I can help it, unless they coincide with my 2x4s. But yeah, I'm just putting those fasteners as tight up against that corner that I've folded already as possible. So you're gonna also, if it's a winter type of job, you're going to put the pan liner in a heated room, maybe with a space heater or whatever. I think, and in this case, this was early spring, so I set it out in the sun. It gets more supple. It's easier to manipulate and to fold and all that stuff when it's hotter as opposed to when it's cold. And so I think all I'm showing here is where the folds end up being on the curb, because it's going to kind of replicate what I did on the back, with one exception, and that exception being, of course, my pan liner is going to drop down over the curb as opposed to the back end where it's just folded and continues on. Always a difficult thing trying to videotape and do the work at the same time to make sure you get clarity on what I'm showing. This helps to have two people, one person holding up the pan liner straight up on that inside portion of the curb where my arm is at, as the other person sets the fasteners into that fold that you created and that you will see on the other side when I'm able to show it more clearly. So that eventually you're going to take a razor knife, a very sharp razor knife, don't use a dull blade, and you're going to go to the very bottom of that curb, which I'll show here momentarily, and you're going to cut a nice clean cut as close as to that wall as you can, because you want as much pan liner to drop down over your curb as possible. You don't want to be shy of that. And here I'm just putting the fasteners up on that that top end over there, and I haven't made the cut yet. As I said, if I had a second set of hands, I would have already made that cut on the left side, but I'm going to show that here in a few minutes once I get this pan liner set in place. And if you don't have scabbing to go into, then I suggest highly that you put some in, because you don't want your fasteners to be lower again than that 3 inches. I think I've probably got about 7 or 8 inches on my fasteners right there, which is ideal. The higher the better. This is where the razor knife comes in. You put your finger down there at the bottom of the curb to know exactly where your razor knife goes into. Do your little cut straight up, and that pan liner will drop right down over the curb. And I had a little excess there that I'm cutting. Same on that left side. Now, because the ends of the curb right there are usually the Achilles heel, that's where you find damage on those 2x4s left and right after a shower's been around for 10, 15, 20 years. There is what's called dam corners, and it's basically PVC material. The same PVC material that you see here will wrap around those corners. It's a double fold type of corner that, well, you can just Google dam corner and you will find what I'm talking about, and they get glued in right at that transition in the left and right side. I don't use them because once my wallboard goes over that, overlaps onto my pan liner and wood, the wallboard and my curb material gets waterproofed, which is ultimately what you're trying to do too. Anyway, you're trying to prevent water from getting into that crevice on the left and right side of your curb, And since my wallboard and my curb material facilitates the waterproofing, I feel that the dam corners are redundant and not needed, and therefore I don't use them. But you are free to do so if you feel like it, because that's usually where we're fixated on. You see that hospital fold? So it's a pretty thick. It's 3, if you can see right there, it's about 3 liner thick, and it's going to be that way also on the other side. But you know, when I'm putting the wallboard up there, it pushes up against that pan liner enough. It pushes up there enough to where the wallboard actually attaches. There might be a slight bump out at that end, and I think that's what people are fearful of, and that's why they put their wallboard into their pan and then pour their pan, because they want, somehow or another, they feel like that bump out is going to cause them angst later on, and it honestly doesn't, not for me. We'll get to that a little bit later, because when I show that on the corners in the back. Right now I'm searching for the center of my hole, which is where my drain barrel, or sorry, my locking flange is going to go down into, and I'm cutting an X right there, and I'm not going to the edge of the drain flange proper, the bottom flange. I'm going probably shy of that by about 1.5 inches or so. And I do the same thing, little X's with the bolts, and I think that's what I'm doing there. So once I cut my my X for my drain, then I cut the little tiny X's for the barrel of my bolts. Some people put the bolts in first, and then the head of the bolt kind of props up on the liner, and then they cut a larger X for the head of the bolt, which doesn't make any sense to me. And so I do it in opposition to that, as I do most things, and I do the barrel of the bolt should fit in there snugly. And that's why I do the little X first, very small X, and I push the barrel of the bolt through there so it's a very, very tight fit. There's also a ridge on that bottom flange, and that ridge should have a bead of caulking on it, so that if the drain ever backs up, that it can't back up into up under the pan liner and onto your subfloor. So I didn't show the caulking process, but just to let you know. And here I'm just attaching those bolts that I've already made the holes for and all that stuff, and this is a locking flange. And the locking flange has troughs, it has weep holes. I think in this case there's 8 weep holes, as well as, you know, you see those cutouts where the bolts go into. They're very, very large. So please don't get focused on the 4 weep holes that you have, or 6 weep holes, or 8 weep holes, because there's many more than that, especially on this particular drain. As I said, there is the cutouts that are on where the drain barrel screws down into. You'll notice on this drain, or maybe you noticed already, there are some cutouts there where water is able to evacuate, as well as where those bolts are, as well as the troughs that are on the top of that locking flange, as well as the weep holes. So there's many, many ways for water to evacuate. Don't get fixated on, oh, I'm clogging my weep holes. If you're clogging anything, it's going to be all of that stuff. But again, it's a moot issue. Get your drain cap, make sure that it's level left and right, front and back, before you put your mortar bed in there. I don't do the pebbles. I don't believe that mortar mix and pebbles, which was basically what you end up, there's I think 1.5 inches, what you end up with concrete. I think the pebbles, if anything, would clog up the weep holes. They are a denser material than the mortar mix itself. So you could use pebbles, you could use, you know, rubber spacers, you could use a weep hole protector, which is a plastic piece that goes over the barrel of the drain and protects your weep holes. But I don't, because again, you know, we're waterproofing the pan surface, so I don't anticipate water ever getting into my bed. Here I'm just showing the dry pack process, where, you know, I'm squeezing the mortar together, and it really shouldn't fall apart like it is there, so I'm going to add a little bit more water. Oh, by the way, the water to and the water to your mortar mix, the ratio that I use, and I was showing it just a little earlier, if you go back you'll see, I'm using a full soaked sponge times at least, it's about 4 spongefuls per bag, per 60-pound bag. 4 spongefuls approximately per bag of mortar mix. So I'll go through, I think, probably about 2.5, maybe about 2.5 gallons of water at the most per 4 bags, because I'm thinking in this case I'm using 4 bags of mortar, and that's about as proximate as I can tell you. The best thing to do, as I said before, you squeeze that mortar together when everything's fully mixed thoroughly, and when you squeeze it together, then that compact area that you've squeezed together should not ever have any type of degradation. In other words, it's not going to fall apart like it did before. So right here I'm showing one way, which is probably the most popular way of setting your pan mortar, and that's to screed out mortar right there around the perimeter. And the perimeter is where you're going to work off of to get it down to your drain. And that's not the way I do it. I've done it that on a few occasions. It doesn't work for me, but I'm showing it anyway, because this is, as I said, probably the most popular way to screed out your mortar. You pack it down really well, and it's usually about 4 inches or so of mortar that goes around your perimeter. You put a level from that point down to your drain. Make sure you have 1/4 inch per foot, although that's not written in stone. It can be more than that. I suggested that it be more than that. Once that's level and packed down well all the way on all 4 sides is when then you take the rest of your mortar and you pack it in going down to your drain. There's another way that some I think DIYers or homeowners might find more beneficial, and that's to use a screed board. So a screed board would be, and I'm going to show that in a minute. Here I'm just marking with a 2x4, which is actually 1.5 inches. I'm just marking it with a Sharpie to show where I'm going to start my dry pack on the perimeter, and then I'm going to put a screed board in there. And a screed board is basically a guide, if you will, so that I guess in essence what you're going to do is use some type of boards, whether it's 2x4, 2x or 1x. I guess a 1x6 would work too, and you're going to have to make an angle cut. It's going to be higher at the back and then lower at the front where your drain is at. So say your drain is at 1.5 inches that I showed you earlier from the bottom of your mortar bed. That 1.5 inch screed board would be cut to that size, and then if it's say 2.5 inches toward your back, then in kind the back end of your screed board would be 2.5 inches, and that's what I'm basically showing you there, where you do your cut at an angle. Once that cut is made and once you have your appropriate slope, then you just set that board in all 4 corners of your shower. You could use more boards if you wanted to. You could use 6 boards, but eventually you're just packing up around that board, as I'm showing right here. You just pack up your mortar all around that board that goes down to your drain. In this case I'm just showing an example so it doesn't go down to the drain. Once all your mortar is packed around that screed board, then you just dump all your mortar between the boards, pack it down really well, as I'm showing there. Let that mortar set up for about an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours or so. Get a little stiffness to your mortar pack. Then later on you can come in and pull those boards out. So whether you have 4 of them, 6 of them, 8 of them, it doesn't really matter. That's an easier way, I think, for a homeowner to make this happen. Pull the board out, take some more mortar, put it in the gap that you've left when you pull the board out, and then you make sure that that gap is fully packed down. And that's probably the easiest way. There is a plastic configuration called Pitch Perfect that they sell online, and it goes by the same premise, where they give you, I think, 6 of those in different areas, and you just pack your mortar down between those rails. The only difference is those plastic pieces for that configuration stay in place. They never come out. If you're going to make your own screed boards, then of course, yes, you would pull them out. I've had a couple of showers where they've used screed boards and left them in the shower. Big time no-no. You don't mix that material. Wood is going to contract and expand, especially with moisture, so you definitely would not leave those boards inside. The way that I choose to do my mortar bed is what I'm showing here, in opposition to the 2 methods that I just showed. I throw my mortar, all of it, in and kind of equal out the amount of mortar that I have in all my areas. As a rule, I'm not throwing my level on there in any direction until probably, so a mortar bed takes me approximately 30 to 40 minutes to set. And I think it's probably 20 to 25 minutes into moving this mortar around that I ever actually get a level out. I have a pretty good eyeball on where my slope is, where my high point, my low point is going to be, and all that stuff. So I just throw my mortar in there, I move all my mortar around where I think it needs to be, and then I start doing all the packing. As you see here, I'm just packing it down really, really well. And I can't emphasize that enough. I get emails at least 1 or 2 a month, if not a phone call, saying that they had done their mortar bed and that it, the next day or 3 days later it was crumbling or it was soft or it cracked or something. I don't know. It's never happened to me. But my take on it is the pack down process was never done properly. So I'm always adamant about making sure that happens. And you see I'm using a float around the drain specifically, because around that barrel people will miss that. All the mortar around that drain barrel has to be done, and my trowel is too large to make that happen, and there I'm using my level for the first time. So that's why I use a rubber float to pat my mortar down around that drain. It works out. Whatever tool you happen to use, it's not the importance of the tool, it's what you end up doing with it, right? So if I wasn't using my trowel in this particular case, you could use a 10-inch drywall blade. You could all kinds of tools you could use. In fact, you could use a piece of 2x4 if you don't have a trowel to pack everything down, or 2x6 or whatever. It doesn't really matter what the tool is. The process of making it happen is more important than the tools that you actually have. I don't assume that all homeowners and DIYers are going to go out and spend thousands of dollars worth of tools to the mount the tools that I have. So sometimes you have to improvise, and improvisation if I get the word out, is probably key to any job, but especially in this job. There are a lot of people that will push products and tools, and you have to have, and you have to have, and you have to have, and I just don't believe in that. There are a lot of third world country tile setters that do a very, very outstanding job with a lot less tools than we have, and I've seen it done with my own eyes. So I'm just not fixated on the particular tools. It's the methodology that's the most important to make sure that you have a successful job, no matter what it is. And so, as I said, this process takes me a little while. As I'm packing down around the drain area, I'm going to be throwing a level on there occasionally, and I'm going to be doing that to make sure that I have that pitch, but also that all 4 sides are level, because eventually when I put my wallboard down, I want that same gap, and I do have a gap on my wallboard between the pan and the wallboard itself, but I want that gap to be equal. If I have half an inch gap or a full inch gap or 3/4 or on the left side, I want that same to show up on the other side. So yes, I want it consistent all 4 sides around, and I want it level as possible too. Tilers have a bad habit. I don't say it's a bad habit. Tilers have a habit of making their pan surface look as pretty as possible, and it's a little bit insane, because eventually you're going to be tiling on top of it anyway. But prep is the key, and as much as you can get your pan surface as perfect as possible, the easier it'll be to tile later on. And that's why I'm going through such an arduous process here of getting everything perfect, especially around my drain, because all my tile is finite on the thickness around that drain. So therefore the parameter that I'm dealing with around the drain has to be up to par. And there's where I'm putting my level left to right, and I'll put it front to back as well, and right side and left side going diagonally. Make sure I have my proper pitch going down. And again, that pitch is, and I'm screeding off here with another cheaper level that I have. I'm screeding off the excess, because as I put my level on there, and you can drag your level across the way I'm doing to find out if you have any discrepancy, if you have high spots and things like that. And I chose to use a level. Any straight edge will work. If you have a long piece of metal or something like that, then that becomes your straight edge, and then you can just screed off and make it as level as possible. So from those corner areas, as I'm doing there, obviously I have high spots going on. From those corner areas, and you put a straight edge from your drain back to that corner, there shouldn't be any discrepancy. That level or straight edge or whatever you're using shouldn't rock back and forth. If it does, it means you have a high spot, and so you have to take care of that. And here is the final pan mortar proper that is set and ready to dry. Any cement material needs a cure time of at least 20 days. Some call for 22, 24, 25 days. I don't have that time to wait, but I'm going to put a fan on this pan, as I do with every pan, for roughly about 72 hours. In that time span, I'm putting wallboard up, I'm taping, I'm mudding, I'm doing my red guard, I'm doing all kinds of other stuff, and when I leave in the evening, I'm putting the fan right back on it. So you want as much cure time as possible. And you see how I did those folds in the corner. So I just wrapped them around on the inside portion as I did on the curb area that you saw earlier. And make sure that you have, I'm just showing level on all four sides. So again, to reiterate, cement products need a cure time, and when I say I put a fan on it, it's not directly on it, it's just moving air around. Just checking the level of my drain. The drain has a little bit of play in it. If you get it to this point here and you're maybe a quarter of an inch off or an eighth of an inch off, you can move that drain in place a little bit. You might even want to put a weight on it overnight, let that mortar cure up around it. But to the point of putting the fan not directly on it, I'm just moving air around because the mortar wants to cure on its own with the water and the chemical reaction. And I'm just showing where I leave that gap, about 3/4 of an inch gap for my tile to slide under. My floor tile will go next after the red guard process. It will slide right into that gap, as well as on the inside of the curb. So I have about 2 inches of wallboard, and in that case Durarock, that I'm going to put on the inside of the curb as well as the outside of the curb and the top. And I'm showing here the final process. But yeah, that gap is intentional, and you can go to my other videos and watch those as far as why I put that gap there. I don't want my wallboard touching my pan. Even though my pan is waterproof as well as the curb and everything else, I don't anticipate water will ever get into anything below the surface of what I have currently once my wallboard is up and all that stuff. But yeah, that's the process right there. And so hope you got something out of it, and hope I answered as many questions as I possibly could on that video. Hey, if you enjoyed that video and you learned something, consider being a Patreon member. $5, $10, $15 a month would help me greatly produce more videos. I make nothing from YouTube at all. If you're going to call me for advice, please donate $50 for 30 minutes. My link to my PayPal and my Patreon account is down below. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so you get immediate notifications as soon as I post videos. And thank you very much for your support.